What if the ham in your supermarket isn't just unhealthy, it's hiding a billion-euro problem? In 2025, organised crime, additives like nitrites and global shipping costs are colliding to push your grocery bill higher than you think. Today, we're breaking down the hidden frauds and supply chain risks that silently shape what you pay at checkout. But here's the real question. If Europe already convicted fraud rings making 20 million euros a year from horse meat, how much of what we call food prices is really just the cost of deception? The hidden billion-euro shadow market. How could a hot dog at a football match or a piece of tuna at your dinner table be part of a billion-euro criminal industry? It sounds too far-fetched at first. Yet those ordinary items are exactly where some of the most lucrative food fraud schemes hide. Behind the shelves and menus we take for granted, networks have turned everyday products into steady streams of illicit profit, sometimes worth tens of millions a year. Food fraud is not petty theft, it is a structured business model in its own right. Look at the horse meat networks that operated across Europe. Investigations revealed that swapping cheaper cuts of horse for beef generated about 20 million euros annually for those involved. That wasn't by chance. It was organized substitution that ran through complex layers of suppliers, processors, and traders. Tuna has its own version. By treating older or lower quality tuna with substances designed to give the fish a fresher red tint, groups have pulled in 12 million euros every year. Both schemes took something people believed was genuine and turned it into a disguised profit stream. The consumer experience is where the tension lies. People buying packaged beef or ordering tuna steaks assume strict labels guarantee what is inside. They believe the item has passed through food safety controls. But the hidden reality is that what looks like beef may come from an unknown horse carcass, and what looks like fresh tuna may have been treated with nitrate-based additives designed not for safety but for visual trickery. The substitution isn't just cosmetic, it erodes quality and in some cases carries health risks. These are risks the buyer pays for twice, first in the retail price and again in the form of potential medical consequences. The horse meat scandal provides a telling illustration. What surfaced in Irish supermarkets could be traced back through French and Dutch intermediaries, and even further to Romanian slaughterhouses. Each stage in that chain had records, invoices, and official certifications. On paper, nothing looked suspicious. Yet the further investigators dug, the clearer it became that multiple jurisdictions and complex trading structures created perfect cover for fraud. Years of unnoticed substitution disguised as legitimate trade proved how easily a system meant for efficiency could be exploited when too many actors shared too little accountability. Tuna fraud uses chemicals more subtly, but the incentives are the same. By treating tuna with nitrates to mask its age, suppliers can sell fish at full market value that would otherwise be downgraded or discarded. Consumers see a vibrant red fillet and assume freshness. What they don't see is that nitrates, while legal in controlled settings, can carry health risks when used to cover up spoilage. From one side of the transaction, it is a neat profit. From the other, it loads costs onto hospitals, families, and health systems that deal with the consequences of chemical adulterants. Organized criminal groups understand well how to infiltrate legitimate distribution chains. They don't sell fake products on street corners. They slip into the trade of approved suppliers, processors, and wholesalers. That placement gives them steady access to legal markets, and it hides their activities within networks designed for efficiency and speed. As a result, the extra costs of fraud are not free. Retailers price them in, supply chains absorb them, and shoppers shoulder them unknowingly at the checkout. If producers can substitute or chemically treat meat and fish under this model, what happens in other supply sectors we trust? Oils, wines, even basic commodities. Wherever there is a price gap between premium and ordinary quality, fraud has room to flourish. This is why food fraud feels distant, yet strikes directly at household budgets. It erodes confidence, but more importantly, its costs show up invisibly every week when totals ring higher than expected at the register. And if organized networks already operate at this scale while regulations exist on paper, the real question is why such fraud continues to thrive. The answer begins with the enforcement gaps built into the system itself. Why regulators keep falling behind? If Europe already caught and convicted organized fraud rings, why do these scandals keep returning as if nothing has changed? At first glance, it seems contradictory. Major investigations broke apart the horse meat network, high-profile trials handed out sentences, and European audits mapped out vulnerabilities. Yet within a short time, new schemes emerged, using slightly different techniques. The persistence raises a question. Are the criminals simply one step ahead, or is the regulatory shield far more fragile than it looks? The system relies heavily on layers of rules that do not always connect. Each country has national policies, inspections, and labs, but food often crosses 5 or 6 jurisdictions before it reaches shelves. In theory, the EU sets overarching standards. In practice, oversight is fragmented between national agencies, voluntary industry checks, and EU-level audits that rarely intervene in real time. This patchwork means enforcement strength depends on where the fraud passes through. A shipment in Denmark might be screened closely, while a similar shipment routed through another country might face lighter review. For organized actors, it becomes a matter of route planning, not avoiding law altogether. Court rulings do exist and sometimes carry high visibility, but their effect is uneven. Fraud rings adapt quickly, shifting from beef to other meats, or from direct substitution to chemical enhancement, in ways that are harder to trace. Every new regulation closes one door while leaving another slightly open. Auditors can spot systemic flaws, but their reports become public long after fraudulent batches have already been sold and consumed. That time gap gives criminals the edge. Denmark illustrates how proactive risk management can differ from the broader EU pace. When Danish authorities identified the hazards of nitrite misuse in meats, they acted more swiftly, tightening nitrite allowances and setting stricter monitoring. The rest of the EU debated longer, delaying consistent rules across borders. This uneven timing leaves loopholes. Producers looking to bypass limitations can ship goods through jurisdictions slower to adjust, widening the space in which fraud thrives. Industry lobbying further complicates intervention. Food is a critical sector, and industry groups push back when proposed enforcement measures could raise costs or disrupt established trade patterns. Lobbying can stall reforms in Brussels or water down proposals before they become law. What looks like technical consultation often turns into procedural deflection, slowing the pace at which regulators can translate scientific alarms into binding rules. For fraudsters, every month of delay is a window of opportunity. Retailers also play a role in shaping visibility. Large chains conduct thousands of tests each year, from DNA traces in meat to chemical residue scans in seafood. Yet only results that point to direct health hazards must be disclosed. Findings of mislabeling without an immediate medical threat often stay internal. The public sees recalls when contamination poses acute danger, but rarely sees the quieter flow of fraudulent substitution uncovered but not exposed. This selective reporting masks how common misrepresentation really is across the system. Even when networks are caught, punishments often fail to deter. Prosecutions are rare relative to the suspected scale of fraud, and financial penalties usually measure far below the annual profits generated by the schemes. For a criminal group making millions each year, A modest fine can be written off as a manageable business expense. Without penalties that exceed the financial lure of fraud, the incentives remain tilted toward deception. The pattern is clear. This is not a problem of isolated bad actors or occasional scandals. It reveals systemic weakness within modern food markets where legal frameworks lack cohesion, enforcement is reactive, and penalties rarely outweigh profits. Regulations, audits, and convictions may exist on paper, but they cannot contain fraud when the structure rewards adaptation. And fraud is not the only pressure. Beyond these enforcement gaps, larger forces, geopolitical conflicts, tariff disputes, and supply chain shocks are already straining the food economy and pushing up the prices you pay. When geopolitics meets the grocery store, what do tense negotiations over tariffs between major economies or cargo ships taking detours around the Red Sea have to do with the price of eggs in your fridge? At first glance, nothing at all. Ships, trade disputes, and foreign policy sound far removed from a grocery run. But in practice, every one of those macro forces filters down into food systems that are already exposed, adding costs in ways that consumers feel directly in checkout totals. When ships face reroutes or tariffs alter trade patterns, the impact stretches beyond logistics. It amplifies the fragility of food markets that were already carrying the hidden costs of fraud and regulatory gaps. Global supply chains function as amplifiers. If the input structure is already fragile, even a small disruption magnifies through the system. Shipping rates, oil markets, and chemical supplies are not abstract variables. They connect tightly into the production of food, petroleum for fuel, natural gas as a base for fertilizers, chemicals for preservation, plastics for packaging materials, and freight capacity to move products. A shock in any of these categories doesn't stay confined to industrial reports. It creates measurable shifts in supermarket pricing within months. A key measure of this anxiety is visible in procurement surveys showing record-high concern levels about disruptions. Categories like maritime shipping, energy markets, and new tariffs top the charts of risks that executives rank as most certain and most impactful. This concern is not theoretical. Freight costs spike whenever a route like the Red Sea becomes unsafe. Insurance premiums for shipping lanes climb when piracy risk or conflict looms. These extra charges fold into shipping containers carrying wheat, rice, frozen poultry, or dairy powders, and suppliers pass them along piece by piece until the additional totals land in consumer bills. Higher energy prices intensify the same process. Fuel is inseparable from agriculture, whether it powers tractors in wheat fields or refrigeration in long-haul transport. Fertilizer itself is largely a product of natural gas markets, so an increase in gas prices transforms into an increase in growing costs for dozens of crops. Packaging materials, from plastics to coated papers, also stem from chemical and petroleum feedstocks. When oil prices rise, food companies cannot isolate themselves. Every step from seed to shelf faces higher input expenses. Tariffs stack on top by raising border costs on commodities and semi-processed goods. Even if food itself isn't taxed directly, additives, machinery, or feed imports often are, reinforcing inflationary pressure across the supply chain. Concrete figures underscore this cascade. Forecasts have suggested that food and beverage categories may experience double-digit percentage cost rises in certain outlooks, more than 10% in some cases. These are not isolated to specialized luxury goods. Basic household baskets are affected. From dairy processing that depends on imported feed to coffee roasters dealing with shipping premiums, every stage translates global disruptions into higher retail tags. Procurement managers see these inputs before consumers do. When their cost projections climb, they adjust contracts with retailers accordingly. Supermarkets receive invoices with higher product charges, forcing them to price goods up to maintain margins. This process transforms distant geopolitical flashpoints into everyday grocery inflation. Importantly, leaders at this stage cannot predict the exact scale of impact. Surveys show not only heightened concern, but also notable uncertainty. Unlike weather forecasts that can rely on seasonal patterns, geopolitical shocks by definition remain unpredictable. An unexpected blockade, a sudden set of tariffs, or volatility in oil prices can trigger shifts that analytics models struggle to capture in advance. And unpredictability locks in a second effect beyond price increases. It breeds volatility. Every spike in freight or energy markets may later ease, but the instability itself embeds into contracts, risk calculations, and hedging mechanisms. Investors grow cautious when forecasting cost baselines, leading to more conservative projections that often overshoot real inflation. That cycle pushes added costs further down to consumers. Global events don't simply nudge price indexes upward, they hardwire uncertainty into the entire system of food economics. From shipping bottlenecks to tariff standoffs, disruptions lift commodities, but also embed volatility into the structure of pricing itself. This is what carries into the official forecasts for 2025 and 2026. When agencies begin to quantify how much of tomorrow's grocery bill stems not from harvests or herds, but from the geopolitical terrain shaping the trade routes and input markets that feed them. The 2025 checkout shock. How much more is your grocery bill going to rise in 2025, and which products will hit hardest? That question isn't about guesswork. It's already being mapped by official forecasts, and the numbers tell a story that's more layered than a flat everything costs more. According to the latest estimates, food prices overall are projected to increase by around 2.9% in 2025. That may sound modest at first, but the breakdown shows the pinch will be uneven, and certain staples could see dramatic jumps. At the broadest level, groceries bought for the home are expected to rise by about 2.2%, while dining out comes in higher, closer to 4%. This split reminds us how different segments of food spending respond to pressures. Restaurants must factor in labor costs, energy surcharges, and rent alongside raw ingredient prices. Supermarkets, in contrast, pass along farm and transport costs more directly. But averages mask what households really experience, because individual products swing up or down much more sharply. Beef is a striking example. Projections point to nearly an 8.8% climb for beef in 2025. Behind that number lie real constraints. Cattle herds remain smaller after reductions in recent years, and rebuilding herd sizes takes time measured in breeding cycles, not months. Low supply paired with strong demand drives prices up faster than broad inflation. Eggs show an even steeper trajectory. Forecasts suggest an increase of about 24.6% in 2025, one of the sharpest jumps in the basket. The reason is production shocks. Avian flu outbreaks have thinned flocks, creating shortages that compound quickly in a category many households buy weekly. A dozen eggs becomes a far heavier line item when nearly 1/4 is added to the price. Not all items move upward. Fresh vegetables are expected to fall by around 2%, reflecting favorable growing conditions and steady supply chains that bring produce into markets at lower costs. This reveals the uneven nature of food inflation. While meat and egg surge, produce may counterbalance slightly, though not enough to offset the more costly proteins in the average diet. Shoppers will notice that some aisles ease, while others, especially the meat case and dairy section, continue to pressure budgets. These point estimates come with wide ranges, underscoring the uncertainty baked into forecasting. The USDA makes clear that expected changes rest within bands that could swing much higher or lower, depending on shocks that can't be modeled with precision. Another avian flu wave, A drought in beef-producing regions or even prolonged shipping bottlenecks could shift those bans upward quickly. On the other side, favorable weather or improved disease control could soften them. Consumers and retailers operate under this uncertainty, never knowing if the peak is ahead or already past. Consumer behaviors also feed into the equation. In recent years, demand has leaned toward cleaner ingredient lists and more sustainable packaging options. While those trends work toward resilience in the long term, they carry short-term costs. Switching to new packaging materials often means tapping supply chains still developing at scale, and certifying cleaner label products demands higher compliance spending by processors. As these shifts roll out, price tags adjust accordingly, layering consumer-driven factors on top of production and supply costs. For investors, volatility itself becomes a factor. Food categories with large swings hold both risks and opportunities. Companies producing alternative proteins may benefit if beef prices continue rising. Packaging firms specializing in sustainable options may find strong demand as brands compete to show credibility. Yet sharp corrections can reverse momentum quickly, making timing crucial. Volatility in food pricing is no longer only about what families pay. It is becoming a measurable variable in investment strategies. Put together, the projected numbers show more than weather cycles or farming yields. The increases in beef and eggs, the modest decline in vegetables, the divergence between home and restaurant food, all of them are influenced by fraud, regulatory gaps, geopolitical costs, and shifting consumer priorities. Prices in 2025 and beyond represent the cumulative weight of those forces, turning the grocery basket into a reflection of larger systemic pressures. Understanding these levers is not just about budgeting for weekly shopping, but about anticipating the financial and policy landscape they reveal. Conclusion: food prices are not driven only by droughts, harvest cycles, or supply levels. They reflect a much broader ecosystem where fraud reshapes markets, weak enforcement leaves gaps, and global shocks introduce volatility that never fully disappears. Every rise at the checkout is a mix of visible and invisible inputs. The next time your total climbs higher than expected, consider what share comes from fraud, fragile oversight, or supply disruptions. Stay informed about forecasts, question where food comes from, and plan carefully. Thinking strategically about food costs is no longer optional. It is part of financial awareness and daily resilience.